our apologies for the glitch. And once again, thank everybody for coming tonight. We're a volunteer organization. We've been spending the last 15 years working on trying to make our civilization more sustainable and more renewable. Welcome Dr. Doug Talamy. He's been a professor. He's a teacher at the professor at the University of Delaware. He's taught there for the last 40 years in entomology and ecology departments. And he's written some fantastic books. On a personal note, my wife was a botany degree from the University of Maryland in the 60s, and after reading his books, she's changed the whole way she's looking at horticultural gardening. And so it's made a big impression on us, and I hope that you enjoy the talk as much as we've enjoyed his books. Dr. Talamy, if you'd like to go ahead.
Okay, thanks a lot. I'm going to get rid of faces here. I want to talk to you tonight about my view of what nature's best hope for the future is. But before I do that, let's go back to last fall. There was an event last fall, and it looked like this. All the red oaks up and down the East Coast, actually as far west as the Mississippi. All the red oak group got together and decided they would make their acorns at the same time. That is called an oak mast. And if you are easily entertained like I am, maybe you got an acorn and just stared at it for a while. And if you stared long enough, you might have seen this happen. A little blemish occur on the side of the acorn, and it became obvious pretty quickly something was chewing its way out of that acorn. And it chewed and it squirmed, and it looked like the Pillsbury Doughboy, and it forced its way through that little hole and finally plopped down onto the ground. And this is a very dangerous time. This is an insect larva, of course, and it is full of protein, full of fat, very tasty little morsel, and lots of things want to eat it. So it has to get below the ground as fast as possible. So more squirming, back and forth, and about 30 seconds down it goes, where it stretches back and forth and creates a little chamber. And within that chamber, that larva converts itself into a pupa, and then it stays there for 2 years. And after 2 years, it comes out, it's an acorn weevil. Now, you might think weevils have long noses, but they don't. That's an extension of the head capsule, and the mouth parts are actually way down here. And what the female weevil does is chew a hole down into the center of the acorn, turn around and lay an egg, the egg hatches, and that's how the larva gets into the acorn where it can develop safely. Now, you might also wonder why she spends 2 years underground. Why doesn't she come out the next year? And the answer is that red oak acorns take 18 months to develop. So if she came out the next year, there'd be very few acorns for her to use. Well, that leaves a hole in the acorn. And of course, nature abhors a vacuum. We've heard that, and there's truly a vacuum in there. That actually is it's a wonderful thing for ants in the genus Temnothorax. There are 3 species that live inside of acorns that have been vacated by acorn weevils. So if a scout discovers a hole, he gets very excited, invites the entire colony to move in from their old dilapidated acorn. So everybody helps. They carry larvae, and it's a frenetic event. But within about 30 minutes, the entire colony is moved inside the new acorn. They post a guard right there. There's his antennae to make sure no uninvited guests come in. But they will now live inside this acorn for the next 2 years until it falls apart. Well, it's about this time that my wife Cindy says, "What's your point? What are you trying to tell us?" My point is that this is one of millions of very specialized interactions that comprise nature. Now that one happens in my yard, and it probably happens in your yard too if you have oak trees. Here's another one that happens in our yard, the very specialized interaction between blue jays and acorns. Blue jays are the primary dispersers of acorns. But this is my point. Nature is full of specialized relationships. If you want pileated woodpeckers to breed in your yard, you've got to have a lot of carpenter ants, because that is what they feed their young. They eat carpenter ants throughout their life, as a matter of fact, which means they've got specialized physiology to be able to eat a lot of formic acid. Ants are filled with formic acid. And of course, you won't have carpenter ants unless you have the big trees that make those carpenter ants. You won't have this bee, Andrena facilii, unless you have that plant, Facilia, because that is the only pollen that that species of bee can rear its young on. As a matter of fact, there are 13 species of native bees that can only rear their young on the pollen of sunflowers. Not the giant ones we grow for birdseed, but the perennial sunflowers that are so common. So there we go. Nature is a series of specialized relationships. Things like the Baltimore checker spot can only develop on white turtlehead. But today, these relationships, nature itself is on the ropes. And it's on the ropes because we didn't take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, Teddy heard that the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon, he looked out over the edge, and he said, leave it as it is. And with those 5 words, he started the creation of the Grand Canyon National Park. Of course, the problem today is that there's very few places we could leave as they were because we've already changed them dramatically. Only about 5% of the lower 48 states is anything close to its original pristine ecological state. And that's because we've logged the country many times over in most places. We've tilled it, we've drained it, we've grazed it. We have 770 million acres of rangeland in the U.S. We've paved it, we've developed it, we've straightened our rivers and dammed them. You can spell that any way you want. We have polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We have drained our aquifers, and we've introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, many of which are now running amok in our natural areas, changing the plant composition. So in short, we've carved up nature into tiny remnants of its former self that are too small and too isolated from each other to sustain the species that actually run the ecosystems that we humans depend on. And we've done that because we thought that our nest, the planet Earth, was so big we could foul it forever. But of course, we were wrong. And that's why we're seeing headlines like this more and more frequently. This came 2 years ago. The insect apocalypse is here. This is talking about global insect decline. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Followed by this headline, we have lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. So that's a third of our North American bird population. As a matter of fact, the UN predicts that we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction, possibly within the next 20 years. And they say, well, humans will suffer. So I could go on. We got a lot of nasty statistics out there, but that's not what this talk is about. I'm not going to talk about the pox we've delivered upon our environment, thus upon all of our houses. I want to talk about a cure for that pox. A cure that'll take small efforts from a lot of people, but they will deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return to this headline. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, E.O. Wilson, the most renowned entomologist of our times, possibly of all times, Harvard emeritus at this point, he still writes a book every single year. But he told us what it would mean if we were to actually lose our insects. And he did it way back in 1987 when he wrote this paper, The Little Things That Run the World. He was talking about the importance and conservation of invertebrates, but largely insects. Let me just point out, this was 1987, and this article was in the very first issue of Conservation Biology. So the formal discipline of conservation didn't start till 1987, believe it or not. Well, in this paper, he had a very simple message. Life as we know it depends on insects. Why is that? Well, because most of the flowering plants, if insects were to disappear, most of the flowering plants on the planet would also disappear. And that would not only change the physical structure of terrestrial Earth, but it would change energy flow through our terrestrial habitats. That's the energy that creates the food webs that supports our animals. The amphibians, the reptiles, the birds, and the mammals, they would all disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the Earth, would essentially rot because we'd lose the insect decomposers that right now rapidly turn over nutrients. And of course, humans would not survive any of those drastic changes. The good news here is that this doesn't have to happen. We can save our insects, we can save our birds, we can save nature itself, but we're going to have to change the way we landscape in order to do it. let's just review quickly. I know most of you don't need this, but it's important to recognize that humans are a product of nature. We totally depend on it. And we formalize that by talking about the fact that we need ecosystem services. And these are just a few of the services that healthy ecosystems produce that we depend on every single day, like oxygen, like clean water. It's plants that are slowing the rainwater's journey to the salty sea where we really can't use it anymore. How about carbon capture? You know all about that. It's plants that are pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, locking it up in their tissues, and most important, they are pumping it into the ground. Our soils are brown or black because of the carbon that plant roots have deposited in them. So plants also build that topsoil and they hold it in place. They prevent floods, they dampen severe weather, all kinds of really important things. What do animals do for plants? Well, they provide pest control services. They pollinate, nearly 90% of them, disperse the seeds, and so on. So, designing landscapes that destroy ecosystems, that destroy ecosystem services is simply not an option. Certainly not today. It never was a good option. But today, with 7.8 or whatever we have billion people on the planet, we need as many ecosystem services as possible. And there were visionaries throughout our history that recognized that we humans had a poor relationship with local ecosystems. And one of the best was Aldo Leopold in the early 1900s. He wrote a number of books, considered the father of modern conservation. And of course, in those books, he said lots of important things, but this was one of them. The oldest task in human history is to live on a piece of land without spoiling it. And of course, we humans have, by and large, been terrible at that. There's some indigenous groups that were pretty good at it, but our Western culture is not. I mean, we spoil one place, move on to another place, spoil that one, and problem is we are out of places to spoil at this point. So Aldo had a dream. He said, we really have to develop what he called a land ethic, and he talked about this in his famous book, Sand County Almanac. And in his dream, we would be able to use the earth. I mean, he knew we had to farm the land and lumber it and graze it and mine it and hunt on it. We had to do all of those things. But if we developed a land ethic, we could do them without destroying local ecosystems. What has always interested me is that Aldo never talked about developing a land ethic where we actually lived. And I'm not sure why that is. But I suspect that the notion that humans and nature cannot coexist in exactly the same place was so deeply embedded in Aldo's culture and still is in our culture today that he didn't recognize it as an option. Well, I'm going to argue tonight that living with nature is an option, and in fact, I'm going to argue it's the only viable option that is left to us at this point. So in the past, conservationists worked exclusively where people aren't. But now we need to save nature where we are. In other words, we need to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes. It's that simple. So where are we going to start? Well, places we can't ignore anymore are privately owned properties. And that's because so much of the U.S. is privately owned. 85.6% of the land east of the Mississippi is privately owned. If we ignored properties like this and only did conservation in areas that were not privately owned, that's only 15% of the land. And that's why you end up with these little preserves here and there that, again, are too small and too isolated to function as they should. But there are also lots of other areas that could be centers for conservation, but right now we're not really thinking of them that way. How about rights of ways, power line rights of ways, pipeline rights of ways, railroad rights of ways, even the sides of roadsides? You're talking about millions of acres that could be used effectively for conservation. Golf courses. 2 million acres in golf courses, 3 million acres in airports. You know, the Denver airport is twice the size of Manhattan. We're talking about big areas here. And then all the places that we live, both in rural areas, suburbia, exurbia, even our urban centers. All of them can be used effectively for conservation if we change the way we landscape. So just these areas, you add it up, that's 599 million acres. How big is that? Well, that's bigger than Vermont, plus New Jersey, plus Maine, Virginia, New York, Georgia, Florida, Oklahoma, Montana, plus California, even adding Texas on there. 599 million acres. So having a place to do conservation is not the issue. There are plenty of places everywhere. And what are we going to do in these places? Well, in most of these places, we have already essentially destroyed natural systems. So we need to put them back together again. We need to rebuild nature. But we want to start with the most important species. Not all species contribute equally to ecosystem function. So let's start with the ones that other species depend on the most. And in terms of sustaining the food webs that transfer energy from plants, remember plants are gathering energy from the sun, turning it into food. Well, if that energy doesn't move from plants to other animals, it's locked up there and lost forever. So which animals are transferring more energy up the food web to higher trophic levels? It's caterpillars. It's caterpillars, totally underappreciated at this point. They transfer more energy than any other type of animal. That includes elephants or anything else. So if caterpillars were to disappear, most of the energy would remain trapped in plants because most animals don't eat plants directly. They eat something that ate plants. And that something is, by and large, insects and caterpillars. Let me give you an example from the Carolina chickadee. We've done a lot of work with chickadees. They rear their young. Now, you think of chickadees as seed eaters because they're eating seeds that are feeder all winter long. But when they're reproducing, they feed their young insects. And if they're in a healthy environment that has a lot of caterpillars, they'll feed their young exclusively on caterpillars. And in fact, they are not exceptions. Most birds, 96% of our terrestrial birds, are rearing their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. How do we know that? Well, I had a PhD student, Ashley Kennedy, who recently finished, and one of her projects was to conduct a citizen science program where she invited people from all over the country to take pictures of birds during the nesting season when they were carrying food items, prey items, back to the nest. And she got close to 7,000 pictures. She identified the prey items that were in their beaks. There's some very good bird photographers out there. So what you're looking at here are 20 bird families, and the green bars are the percentage of the nestling diet that are caterpillars. And in 16 out of the 20 bird families, caterpillars dominate the nestling diet. So imagine what would happen to essentially most of the terrestrial birds if caterpillars were to disappear from our landscape. So there's obviously something special about caterpillars. What is it? Why not other insects? Well, there's several things that are special about caterpillars, and one of them is that they are relatively soft prey items. So think of this guy as a sausage with a very thin wrapper. It's filled with good things to eat, a lot of protein, a lot of fat, and that thin wrapper is exoskeleton, it's cuticle, which is not digestible. So a bird or anything doesn't want a lot of cuticle. They can't digest it. And if it's soft, you can stuff it down the throat of your offspring without fear of injuring it. And if you've ever watched a parent bird rear their young, they're pretty rough. They use their beak like a plunger. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is roughly equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. Now, some of our smaller birds do chase aphids around, but do you want to chase 200 aphids or do you want to get one caterpillar? As I said, they're nutritious, very high in protein, high in fat, low percentage of chitin compared to many other insects, particularly beetles. We do have a lot of beetles out there, but beetles are not like little sausages, they're like little tanks. So they got a lot of chitin and it's undigestible, and they often have a lot of sharp edges. And it turns out that caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. Now, I mentioned carotenoids not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate. And you're a vertebrate, and birds are vertebrates. And vertebrates cannot make their own carotenoids. We have to get our carotenoids from plants. And we have to do that because carotenoids are essential components of our diets. And that's why my wife Cindy says I have to eat my carrots to get my beta carotene, and I have to eat my tomatoes to get my lycopene, my whatever that is to get my lutein. And she makes sure I eat all of that stuff because they stimulate my immune system. And I can't think of a better time to have a very strong immune system. They are also antioxidants. They run around our body and protect our DNA from oxidative damage. Carotenoids improve color vision. When your mother said, eat your carrots, you will see better, she was right. She didn't know she was right, but it turns out she was right. They improve sperm vitality. They improve sexual attractiveness. Now we're talking about primarily male birds like the Sperthonotary warbler, who's had access to lots of luteins. And he's made pigments out of those luteins and put them into his feathers that make him bright yellow. And the brighter yellow he is, the more ladies he attracts. Oops. Well, where are the birds getting their carotenoids from? They're getting them from what they eat, which is the prey items they're feeding their young. But look, the carotenoid content of various prey items is not at all equal. These first two bars are different types of caterpillars. They have way more carotenoids than other types of prey. The third bar are orthopteroids, things like crickets and katydids and grasshoppers. The adult caterpillars down here, the moths and the butterflies, have even fewer carotenoids because they're not eating green leaves. That's where those carotenoids come from. It's the caterpillars that eat the green leaves. And here's the earthworm way down here. So the early bird gets the worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. Does this matter in prey choice? Well, Ashley did another experiment. She put GoPro cameras on the roofs of bluebird boxes at Mount Cuner Center in Hockessin, Delaware. And she had a lot of bluebird boxes and a lot of GoPro cameras, and this went for 3 years. And those cameras took a picture once a second. So she had to go through, it's either 1 or 2 million pictures. There were a lot of pictures she had to go through. But when she did, the idea was to catch the bird as it was flying into the nest, or often it sat on the roof of the nest box before it went into the nest, take a picture of what was in its beak, and then we'd know the frequency with which they're bringing the prey items back, and we already knew what the carotenoid content was. So she had over 7,000 pictures that she got good data from, and caterpillars were the most frequently collected prey item, and they have the most carotenoids, followed by those orthopteroids, and then everybody else is nested down here. So all this suggests that for birds, at least, caterpillars may not be optional parts of the diet. It's really starting to look like they are essential parts of the diet. So if we need caterpillars, at least for birds, how many caterpillars do we need? How many caterpillars do they need? Good question. Let's go back to the chickadees again, because we worked on chickadees, but we have data for lots of other birds as well. How many caterpillars does it take to make a clutch of chickadees? And the answer is 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to get them to the point where they fledge, where they leave the nest. But after they leave the nest, the parents continue to feed the young until they're independent, which is about 24 days after they leave the nest. So just to fledging, it's thousands and thousands of caterpillars, but it's actually a lot more than that. And this is a tiny bird, 1/3 of an ounce. So what happens when we lose these caterpillars, when we lose insects? Well, we took a look at the data that were used to estimate the loss of 3 billion birds. That science paper from Rosenberg et al. Came out in 2019. And it turns out that all bird species did not lose individuals equally. So we divided it up into the bird species for which insects are an essential component of the diet at least one part of their life history, versus the species that don't require insects. These are the finches and the doves and other seed eaters that can reproduce entirely on seed. They actually gained a little bit in terms of numbers, but the ones that the species that depended on insects lost on average about 10 million individuals per species. So it means that there is a very tight correlation between the need for insects and how well you're doing in the environment. So what we need to do is create landscapes that make a lot of insects, and I'm going to say we need to make landscapes that make a lot of caterpillars in particular. So how do we do that? How do we add caterpillars to a landscape? Well, we do that by putting the plants that make caterpillars in that landscape. But there is a catch, and that is all plants don't make caterpillars. So we have to add the right ones. And the reason all plants don't make caterpillars is that most species of caterpillars, about 90% of them, are what we call host plant specialists. They can only eat particular plants. So here's the monarch butterfly, of course, it only eats milkweeds. You can add crepe myrtle to your yard, but you're not going to make any monarchs with it. So we have to add the plants that make the most caterpillars. Let's review quickly why so many insect herbivores are host plant specialists. And it's really quite simple. They're specialists because plants have protected themselves really well. Plants don't want to be eaten. They've loaded their leaves with nasty tasting chemicals. This is one of their lines of defenses that make the leaves either bitter or downright toxic. And it's a really effective defense that keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world. And that's why it's green outside. It's not because there are no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. They are too well protected chemically. And if you don't believe me, after this talk, go outside and eat a plant. See if you like it. You're not going to like it. Every plant protects itself chemically. And it just doesn't taste good. There's a reason it is hard to get our kids to eat their vegetables. They inherently know that vegetables are toxic. Kidding. Well, we do know that insects eat plants. So the real question is, how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? And the answer is this specialization. Over evolutionary time, most insects, again, about 90% of the species that are out there, develop very specialized adaptations, specialized enzymes, behavioral adaptations, life history adaptations that allow them to eat these plants without dying. Those enzymes are detoxifying and storing and excreting the nasty compounds. The behavioral adaptations and life history adaptations help them minimize their exposure to those compounds. But again, it takes a long period of exposure to those plant lineages for these adaptations to fall into place. No insect can beat all of the plants at their defenses. As a matter of fact, our most generalized insects still can only eat about 5% of the plants that are available for them. So all I'm trying to say here is that plant choice matters. And if we're trying to restore ecosystem function in a given place, we have to choose the plants that are going to do that most effectively. And I want to give you some examples of how this works. And I'm going to start with our house here in Oxford, Pennsylvania. This is what it looked like just before we moved in. We moved into a 10-acre partial that had been mowed for hay. As a matter of fact, this whole area was in agriculture for 300 years. So the soil was exhausted. Most of the topsoil was washed down in a gully. And that's what we moved into. So the areas that the bulldozer hadn't plowed up were covered with invasive plants from Asia. Multiflora rose and Oriental bittersweet and Japanese honeysuckle, bush honeysuckle, autumn olive, and porcelain berry. You know all the ones. Well, this is my wife, Cindy, who's getting ready to get rid of all that stuff. Invasive plants are a terrible problem today. And people look at it and they say, well, that's impossible. We can't get rid of them. But old Cindy says you can. I should say young Cindy. And she did. You just start at the corner and she worked hard at it. And we have to be vigilant because we are invaded every year from all the properties around us that did not get rid of their invasives. But while she was working hard, I was playing. My favorite game is to put plants back into our property that support really pretty caterpillars so I can take their picture. And one of the first ones I chose was the Canadian owlet. We didn't have any Canadian owlets. That's what the adult looks like, just like leaves. Well, they're specialists on meadow rue. So after Cindy got rid of the invasive plants, I planted some meadow rue. There wasn't any meadow rue on our property or anywhere around us. I still don't know where there's any local meadow rue. So I got seeds from a friend, planted it, and I really figured it would probably take years for Canadian owlets to find these plants. Maybe they had to come down from Canada, I don't know. So I didn't check the plants. I planted them and they grew 1 or 2 months. Finally, I walked out to see how my meadow rue were doing, and they were practically defoliated by Canadian owlets because the Canadian owlets found it right away. And now I have a thriving population of both meadow rue and Canadian owlets. That worked, and it worked fast. Here's another one that worked, the goldenrod stowaway. I wanted that moth because it's pretty and I like to take pictures. It has nothing to do with goldenrod. That's a misnomer. It is a specialist on Biden's aristosa. People call it ditch daisy. Well, again, we didn't have any ditch daisy, so I planted some, and it took about a year. But finally, the goldenrod stowaway came, and now I have a healthy population of them. Hackberry Emperor. This is a butterfly that ought to be at our house. Well, they require hackberries. We didn't have any hackberries, so I planted some hackberries. This took about 4 years for the butterflies to discover it, but once they did, we've got a great population. This June, I went out and looked at one of the branches on one of my hackberries. It had 9 Hackberry Emperor caterpillars on it. So on and on we go. This is goldenrod. I didn't plant goldenrod. It came in on its own, but along with it came the caterpillars that eat goldenrod. There are 110 species of caterpillars that eat goldenrod. Things like the brown hooded owlet, the Arcigera flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct Sparganothus, the goldenrod gall moth. Now this is what I'm waiting for, the goldenrod flower moth. It's common on goldenrod, but very locally. And after 20 years, we've been here 20 years, it has not found us. So this is anticipation. Every year I go looking for the goldenrod flower moth. It's like waiting for the ketchup to come out. Maybe this will be the year. It's just right about now is where I should start finding it. And that's what the caterpillars look like. I planted Virginia creeper because I wanted to attract the Pandora sphinx so I could take that picture. This took about a year. That's the beautiful adult. But I got a lot of other things that I didn't realize ate Virginia creeper, like the lettered sphinx, the hog sphinx. Waited 19 years for the Abbott sphinx, but it finally came. No more anticipation there. Zebra swallowtail, they're a specialist on pawpaw. I wanted zebra swallowtails because I think it's the prettiest of all of our swallowtails. So we planted pawpaws. Now in this case, we had to wait 9 years because the nearest population of zebra swallowtails that I know of is 26 miles away. But after 9 years, they did find it. But in the meantime, we got things like the pawpaw sphinx and lots of pawpaws. And I planted oaks. Now these are just examples of the things that we planted at home. This is the Bedford oak in Bedford, New York, and people argue about whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old. It's enormous, and a lot of people think you have to have enormous oaks in order to make a difference. Not so. I planted a lot of oaks, and most of them as acorns. So first of all, they were free. That was good. But right away, they started to attract things like the solitary oak leaf miner, Juvenal's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered slug moth, the orange-headed epicalema, the red-washed caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oakworm, the orange-humped oakworm, the pink-striped oakworm, the delightful dagger moth, the pleasant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crowned bucolatrix, the white blotch heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red-lined panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more species have come to the oaks that are in our yard. And they come right away. This is a pin oak, has just come up from the ground, and here's a caterpillar standing practically on the ground eating the pin oak. So they're productive immediately. This is the perspective, I took that first picture when there were no plants. This is just a few years ago. It's what it looks like today. We do have a little lawn here. We're very traditional, but we put the plants back. And right away, I noticed all the moth species that were coming to our yard. And each one of those species, by the way, is bird food. So I made it a goal to take a picture of as many species as I could find. And I am up to 987 species of moths that I have pictures for. And I'm not finished. I keep adding them all the time. That's 987 species of bird food, and because of that, we have recorded 55 species of bird breeding on our 10 acres. So it works, but I know what you're thinking. What if you don't own 10 acres? Will it work in traditional suburban lots? Well, that's a good question. Let's go to Margie and Dan Terpstra's house in Kirkwood, Missouri. I visited them early this spring before the pandemic got going. They are in a traditional suburban setting. They are surrounded by people with big lawns and houses, and so there's no connectivity to any preserve here. But they removed the invasive species on their property, and in Kirkwood, Missouri, that's bush honeysuckle. It's the big one all around the St. Louis area. And then put in some native plants, and they also put in a water feature that they call a bubbler, and they started counting the birds. Now this is on 0.6 acres, so less than 1 acre. 149 bird species they have recorded so far. It's so popular, they have a blog and they take pictures and show them all the time. And that includes 35 warbler species. Now just to put that in perspective, on our 10 acres, we've recorded 8 warbler species. So they're doing pretty well on just 0.6 acres. Can it work in urban yards? Another good question. Let's go to Pam Carlson's house in Chicago. Pam has 1/10 of an acre. It's a tiny little lot, and she is in Chicago. She is right next to one of the runways in O'Hare Airport, right next to Kennedy Expressway. She did the same thing. She got rid of the invasive plants on her property, put in 60 species of native plants and a water feature, and she's counted 116 species of birds that have used her yard, including a woodcock. So if you haven't seen a woodcock lately, you can go to Pam's house. I want to emphasize here, this is the middle of the city. There's no connectivity with preserved land. So she's a tiny island, but it still is working. What about inner cities? 82% of us live in what is defined as a city landscape. So does it work there? Well, in 2014, I was staring at this plant. This is butterfly weed, Asclepias tuberosa. And that reminds me that we have a marketing issue with our native plants. And that is, we call them weeds. Who wants to buy a weed? Weed gives you cultural permission to kill the plant. Well, they're not weeds. A weed is a plant out of place, and these native plants are not out of place. So we're not going to call it butterfly weed anymore. We're going to call it Monarch's Delight. I was staring at Monarch's Delight. And the first thing I saw was a megachilid bee. And I know that's a leafcutter bee. I know it's a megachilid because they collect their pollen on their tummy and not on their legs. Well, megachilids have very specific requirements. They need pollen, they need nectar, but they also need soft leaves because they cut the edges out of those leaves and roll them up and stuff them full of pollen, and that's what they lay their eggs on. Then they stuff that whole roll into a crevice somewhere. Well, right next to the Monarch's Delight was redbud, the perfect soft leaves for the megachilids. So they had everything they needed. The redbud also bloomed early in the spring, so it provided forage for queen bumblebees. Remember, queen bumblebees are alone in the spring. They've got to do all the work until they produce workers. So they need a lot of early spring forage, and the redbud was providing that. And then I saw monarch. Now this was 2014. I had gone all of 2013 without seeing a single monarch. So I was excited. And this was also June. It's very early for monarchs to get this far north. And then I saw another one. There were two monarchs there. And why were they there? Well, they had Monarch's Delight. They also had other species of milkweeds. So they had nectar, but they also had their host plant, so they could reproduce. Do you know where I was? I was on the High Line in the middle of Manhattan, and there's the Monarch's Delight. And this is the High Line. If you've never been there, it's an elevated railroad that has been converted to a tourist destination by adding plants. Not many plants, and a lot of them are native, but not all of them are native. But this trip to the High Line convinced me that we can do this anywhere. I mean, look at the habitat. This is 30 feet above concrete and roads, and you know, this is Manhattan. So if, I don't know why I'm losing my ability here, if thoughtful addition of plants to even the middle of a city center can bring life back to that city center, then I am convinced this can work absolutely anywhere, everywhere. There are 4 keys to success that we need to consider. And the first one I want to emphasize is that we have to shrink the area that's in lawn. And that's because we have way too much lawn. Lawn is a dead space. This is not a functioning ecosystem. Pretty, looks like Gone with the Wind, but all the life around here is Gone with the Wind. And the problem, of course, is the scale. We have more than 40 million acres of lawn in the US, and that is the size of New England. So I'm suggesting that we cut that area in half. Let's put the plants back in half of the area that's now in lawn. And if we do that, we have 20 million acres to work with. We can create a new series of habitats in 20 million acres. If we do this at home, we'll call it a new national park, call it Homegrown National Park. And it'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, that's huge, and Denali is even bigger, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. You add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. What are the benefits of building this park at home? Well, you're not going to get to see Yosemite Falls or any of the grand landscapes, but you can have a personal interaction with nature. And that's something that so many of us have been missing for so long now, particularly our kids. You can develop that relationship with nature at your own time, at your own pace, and right in your own personal space. You can do it by avoiding crowds. This early part of the summer, Cindy and I had to go to Portland, Oregon to help with grandkids because all their camps were canceled and everything. And we took a trip to Mount Rainier National Park. It was just a day trip. We went early and left early. We drove out around 1 o'clock. And as we were leaving, there was a 3-mile backup of cars for people waiting to get into Mount Rainier National Park. You can avoid all that with your Homegrown National Park. It's free. It's never closed, no matter how many pandemics come. So you can avoid those travel hassles. And again, you get to experience the natural world alone. We all worry about our kids not having exposure to nature, so we put them on a bus, 30 kids on a bus, take them to some natural area, and they walk around for an hour, and the teacher tells them not to touch anything, and they get back on the bus and drive back. And we say, well, that's their experience with nature. It is better than nothing. But their real experience is walking with 30 other kids and a teacher who tells them not to touch anything. If they can just walk out their front door and experience nature right there, that is far better. And I learned from my own granddaughter that you get to hunt lizards in Homegrown National Park. And she sent me this picture to prove it. This is how you do it. Her name is Zoe. She lives in Hawaii. Her national park is about 10 by 10 feet, tiny little area, but there are no lizards there. And you can hunt them by crawling very slowly on the ground and disguising yourself with leaves and sticks so they don't see you coming. You can wear your best dress, it's okay. But believe me, she's serious about this, and this is a game that she has created with nature, and she will remember hunting lizards on her front yard for the rest of her life, I guarantee it. And if you want to do more than hunt lizards, get this book, Nature Play at Home by Nancy Stranisti. There are lots of great ideas of what you can do in just small spaces right in your yard. Okay, we're going to shrink the lawn, but the plants we're going to put back in half that area have to be important plants. And I call them keystone plants from research that we've recently come up with in our lab. It turns out that there are really just a few native plants that are doing most of the work in our ecosystems. About 5% are producing about 75% of the caterpillar food, or 14% are producing 90% of the caterpillar food. So what does that mean? It means the question is no longer simply, are native plants better than non-native plants? They certainly are on average, but there are a lot of non-native or native plants that aren't that great in terms of supporting food webs either. So the real question should be, do we want ecologically productive plants in our yard? Or do we want benign plants that aren't doing anything, or even worse, destructive plants? I get emails once or twice a year from people saying, don't I know that ginkgos, ginkgo biloba from Asia, actually grew in North America 7 million years ago? And their argument is, well, that makes them native. I don't know if it does or not, but they say it does. And therefore they can plant them. It'll be great. This is not our metric anymore. It's not whether or not they're native. It's what are they doing? Well, ginkgos produce 0 species of caterpillars. So I don't care if they grew on the moon 7 million years ago. They're not a productive plant in terms of supporting the life around us. What's the most productive plant? It's oaks. And that's true in 84% of the counties of North America. In the mid-Atlantic states, they support 557 species of caterpillars, 557 species of bird food. And nationwide, it's over 900 species of bird food, our most powerful plants. What does that mean for my yard? Well, remember, I'm taking pictures of those moths, and that's moths, not butterflies yet. 987 species so far. Of that 987 species, 864 have known host plants. So there's about 120 that I don't know what they eat. Out of that 864, 258 species use oaks. We have 59 genera of native woody plants on our property, only one of which is the oaks, Quercus. And we have hundreds of genera of herbaceous plants. So oaks represent less than 2% of the woody plant diversity in our property and way less than 1% of all of our plant diversity. But they support about 29%, almost 30% of our moss species. So again, that's what a keystone plant is. Imagine what would happen if I took the oaks out of my property. How do you know what the keystone plants are where you live? You go to Native Plant Finder, National Wildlife Federation website, put in your zip code, and the ranked list of native or woody and herbaceous plants will pop up for your county. And this is true all over the country. Now notice I say here native oaks, native cherries, native willows. You can go to the nursery and you can buy a non-native oak. You can get an English oak or a Chinese oak. You can get non-native cherries. You can get weeping willow from Babylonica. You can get European birch. But when you do that, you lose 68% of the caterpillars that you would have if you used native species of these genera. Don't forget the herbaceous plants. Solidago, goldenrod, remember 110 species of caterpillars. So solidago, asters, and helianthus, the sunflowers. Those three species are top in terms of meeting the needs of specialized pollinators, the ones that can only reproduce on particular types of pollen. Okay, we're going to use keystone plants, and they work really well in our Homegrown National Park, unless we have a lot of light pollution. Because light pollution kills insects, particularly the moths that run our ecosystems. They kill them by exhaustion. They fly around and around and around our lights. After 100 years, we still don't know why insects go to lights, but they do. They collide with them. They get incinerated. They die of dehydration. There's a lot of predators, particularly bats and things, that pick them off. It blinds a lot of our night-flying insects, and it wrecks their daily rhythms, their oviposition and mating and foraging and reproduction. So we're finding out from research, particularly in Europe, that light pollution is one of the major causes of insect declines around the world. So how do we fix that? Well, I know I mean, you can turn your lights out. That's an easy way. But a lot of people say, no, I can't do that because the bad man will come. Okay, put a motion sensor on your security lights. So they only turn on when the bad man comes. And the first thing you will notice is that the bad man doesn't come very often. Another very important thing you can do, even if you don't put a motion sensor on it, is to change that white bulb out and put a yellow bulb in, particularly a yellow LED light. The wavelengths from yellow LED lights are the least attractive to night-flying insects. So overnight, just by changing light bulbs, we could save billions of insects across this country. Fourth thing we need to do is landscape in a way that allows caterpillars to complete their development. What do I mean by that? You know, if a caterpillar doesn't reach adulthood, that's the end of the line. Well, I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, and in Chester County, there's 511 species of caterpillars that develop on oaks. A few of them, like the polyphemus moth, completes its development on oaks. It eats the leaves as a caterpillar, it spins a cocoon, hangs from a branch, and then it emerges as an adult and then does it all again. So I wish everything did that, but most species don't. 480 of them, 94% of them, drop from the tree and wiggle down into the soil and form a pupa underground, or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that's underneath the oak tree. And you know where I'm going with this. There isn't any leaf litter under the oaks in most of our landscapes. The land the soil is compacted so the caterpillar can't get under, and it's mowed and they're chopped up, and it's not a healthy place for caterpillars. So this becomes an ecological trap. The moths fly in, lay their eggs here, the caterpillars develop, drop down, and die. And of course, the cement landscape is an even worse option. I'm not trying to discourage the use of trees in cities. I'm trying to discourage the use of cement. This is just laziness. And it wrecks our watersheds as well. This is what most people do. They have a tree growing in a giant lawn, and nobody's measured the success of caterpillars in a situation like this. But I can guarantee it's not as high as it is in a situation like this, where you have a tree and a layered landscape. Here's a native azalea. You could have a dogwood over here, ferns, ground cover. The moths drop down. And it's a safe site. Nobody's trampling them. Nobody's mowing them. The soil's nice and loose. They can get under there. This is where you can do your spring ephemeral gardening. Again, because it's a safe site, you get high moth survivorship there. Or use your ground covers, things like wild ginger or mayapple or foam flower. And it doesn't have to be a monoculture. There are lots of types of foam flowers that you can mix and match and create safe sites for your caterpillars. An important part of the message here is that there is room for compromise in our plant choices. And this comes from my other grad student, Desiree Naranjo, who has finished up. But she studied chickadee reproduction, Carolina chickadee reproduction in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. She was able to compare how well chickadees populations did in landscapes that were dominated by native plants versus landscapes dominated by introduced plants. And these are all suburban lots. None of the native landscapes were 100% native. And the first thing she found is that landscapes dominated by introduced plants produce 75% fewer caterpillars. So right away, you lost most of the chickadee bird food. They were 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. So Desiree put up nest boxes, so there was equal opportunity in each site, but the chickadees came, they looked around, and they knew. They said, there's simply not enough food here. We're not even going to try. If they did try, they produced 1.5 fewer eggs. Those clutches were 29% less likely to survive at all. The nests produced 1.2 fewer fledglings, and maturation was delayed by 1.5 days. So you might say, well, those aren't huge differences, but when you put all that together in a population growth model, this is what you get. As a function of the non-native plant biomass in your landscape, from no non-native plants all the way to 100% non-native plants. This dotted line is replacement rate. This is the rate at which the population has to reproduce in order to replace the adults that die each year. If you reproduce at this rate, that's sustainable. Your population is not growing, but it's not shrinking either. If you're above that dotted line, you have a growing population, but if you're below it, you have a shrinking population. Well, this is where those lines intersect. It's around 30% non-native plant biomass. So if you have about 70% of the biomass in your yard, native plants, you can have a sustainable chickadee population, and that we presume that means other birds as well. So this is good news to me for two reasons. First of all, this is the first time this has been measured for any plant anywhere. So if anybody doubts that their choice of plants actually impacts the life around them, they should take a look at this study. But here's the area that's interesting to me. It suggests we can compromise. You can have your crepe myrtle, you can have your ginkgo, you can have any of your non-invasive, non-native plants as long as it doesn't exceed 30% of the plant biomass in your yard. And that's good news, because if my message was you can't have any non-native plants, any ornamental plants from Asia, very few people would be listening. Can we use native plants in formal designs? Of course we can. Somebody sent me this picture this past spring, and I can't remember who it was, but he's the land manager for this formal garden, and what he's doing is sneaking in native plants without telling anybody. So here's Joe Pye weed, not a weed, and his goal is to make them all native and just prove that you can use natives in formal designs. Remember, formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. Our native plants are used in formal designs in Europe all the time. And I guess that's okay because they're non-native plants over there. Can we get a pollinator garden into a typical suburban lot like this without people being upset? Of course we can. Just put a little fence around it, a little hardscaping. That's beautiful. It's valuable for the pollinators, particularly if everybody has one of these. Or you can make it a little bit bigger. You don't need your fence. Just make it a little bit formal. Imagine the life here versus here. We need to do this a lot more. Heather Holm, I don't know if she's ever talked for you, but she writes books about native bees. Here's her yard, part of her yard when she first moved in, and here it is after she re-landscaped. A perfect place for spring bees. So it certainly is possible. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Of course they can. Minnesota has a cost-sharing program that encourages homeowners to replace part or all of their lawn with the native plants, the native prairie plants that used to be growing in Minnesota. So the state is actually paying people to convert at least part of their yard into productive plantings. It's a great program. The state of Florida, at least parts of southern Florida, are paying people to allow burrowing owls, a listed species, to burrow in their front yard. And this is the way the Endangered Species Act should have been written. Should have been written with carrots, not with sticks. So that everybody would want an endangered species on their property because you get paid for it. You get paid for protecting it. That's the way to do it. Missouri, I think this program has ended, but it was a bounty on Callery pears, on Bradford pears, highly invasive ornamentals. But if you brought in a Callery pear body, they give you a free tree replacement. And of course, we've got all the lawn replacement programs in the West. California will give you up to $2 per square foot if you take out your lawn and put in appropriate xeric plantings. So all of these programs give you cultural permission to change from that dead landscape that we all have revered so much in the past. We made what I consider to be 3 missteps in the early years of conservation. The first is that we've assumed that nature is important. We like it, but it's not essential. So if it disappears, it's too bad, but we can still watch it on television. I went to the Cincinnati Zoo just before the virus broke out. And there was this wall-size poster that, I see this everywhere, not just this poster, but the attitude that we need to save wildlife so that kids and future generations can appreciate it. So they can see a cheetah, they can know that we had rhinoceroses. In other words, it implies that nature is just for entertainment. Not so. It is so much more than that. We need to save nature so that we have future generations. Sounds dramatic, but it's not. Second misstep is that we've assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. Now, we already talked about this. If we restrict conservation to areas that are untouched by humans, then we've condemned it to failure because there's just not enough of those areas. Those areas are too small and too isolated. They won't work. David Quammen has this superb analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. This is a functional Persian rug. That is not 71 Persian rugs. That's 71 rug fragments, none of which are functioning as a Persian rug. And this is exactly what we've done to our ecosystems. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance. And I hate that terminology because it suggests there are places on planet Earth that have no ecological significance. Places like in between these fragments here. Oh, they don't count. Well, they do count. Every square inch of planet Earth has ecological significance, and that includes our yards, where we work, we play, even where we farm. So what we need to do is put the plants back. We need to glue our rug back together again by making viable habitat in between these remnants. This is no man's land right now. If we put the right plants back, not only can plants and animals move back and forth as biological carters, but they can actually exist in those spaces. Our third misstep was to leave Earth stewardship to a few specialists, a few conservation biologists and ecologists. We didn't see it as an inherent responsibility of every human being on the planet. And I don't know why, because every human being on the planet depends entirely on the quality of Earth's ecosystems. Nobody has the ethical right to trash them. And everybody has the responsibility for good Earth stewardship. It doesn't mean you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you certainly can save it where you live. I like this approach because it empowers each one of us. There are huge environmental issues today, like climate change. If I said to you, I want you to do something to help climate change, and I want to come and measure your success tomorrow, wouldn't be able to do it. You could stop driving your SUV and make your house energy efficient, but I wouldn't be able to measure the difference. It's just too small. But you could plant an oak in your front yard or a black cherry or any of the other powerful plants, and I could come and measure the life on that plant. So it makes you a very important player in the future of conservation, and you can do it as a single person. It also shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think about the entire planet's problems. You get depressed too fast. Just worry about the part of the Earth that you own, you don't own any of it, but the part that we claim we own, or if you don't own land, if you live in a city, your nearest park or preserve, they desperately need volunteers because they're understaffed and underfunded. But do the things we've talked about. Shrink the lawn, get rid of the invasive plants. We didn't talk about that, but that's a no-brainer. Put in pollinator garden, and what else did we talk about? Those are the things you need to do on the little piece of the earth that you own. It's manageable. You can see the results. And if everybody did, remember, 85.6% of the U.S. is privately owned. If everybody did that on their own land, we'd be 85.6 done. So as property owners or volunteers, each one of us has the power to fix dead landscapes like this. We have the responsibility to fix dead landscapes like this. But whether or not we decide to do so is going to determine nature's fate, and then, of course, our own fate in the future. So my grandchildren know that you are nature's best hope. Thanks very much.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Talamy. We have some questions now that people have sent in during the talk. Joe or Chuck, do you have the questions there?
They went home.
Okay,
I have one.
Okay, Joe.
I have one, Bill. First of all, fascinating presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
The first question is, what is the recommended way to deal with aggressive species in gardens or lawns, such as creeping Charlie, crabgrass, oxalis, and do any of these have benefits to wildlife or the environment?
Well, you're basically saying how do you get rid of non-native plants that you don't want? Now, if you're going for that perfect lawn, which of course a lot of people are, there are herbicides. You put a herbicide that kills everything except grasses, and that gets rid of a lot of things. It won't get rid of your crabgrass. But that, of course, is not the approach we're looking for to save biodiversity. Tolerating things, particularly like clover, that flowers and provides a lot of nectar for many of our pollinators, particularly things like honeybee and bumblebees. Now, a lot of the clovers that are in our yards are not native, but clover in general is native. And this is an example of a plant that has a lot of species that are very similar to each other. So if you put in the typical white clover that we use in we used to use in our yards, it does benefit a lot of native species. But you know, the mowing frequently can keep a lot of those pesky plants down. But remember, when we're shrinking the lawn we keep is still going to be manicured. That's a cue for care. That shows that you do care about, you know, you appreciate what the cultural norms of your neighborhood are, and you're not just going to let it go wild. The area you take out of lawn is going to be very productive, but our lawn itself is never going to be a safe site for biodiversity. So mowing it frequently is probably the best way to keep down those bad guys.
Okay. Chuck, do you have a question someone sent in?
I don't. The participants that want to ask a question should click on the participant icon and raise their hand. But what we'll do is we'll ask another one that was sent in from the chat. Do you suggest avoiding Trichloropyro or Dicampa on lawns? If so, what do you suggest?
I don't use anything on my lawn. Probably not happy with that suggestion, but
okay.
You know, again, frequent mowing. We get a lot of rain in this area, so typically we don't have to water. And putting fertilizer and herbicide on our lawn to keep it perfectly green all year is forcing the grass to do something it doesn't want to do. It really wants to go dormant in the middle of the summer. So again, I would recommend frequent mowing, and that usually does the trick.
Okay. The next question is there a natural way to deal with spotted lanternflies? Does planting milkweed help?
No, I don't think so. Somebody sent me a picture of milkweed stems lined with spotted lanternfly this year. So spotted lanternfly, it's an invasive plant. When I talk about we want to encourage insects, I am not talking about non-native insects, because they cause huge issues just like our non-native plants. Just think emerald ash borer, gypsy moth, brown marmorated stink bug, spotted lanternfly, hemlock woolly adelgid. We got plenty of them, and they're all wreaking havoc on our natural systems. So is there a natural way? There's non-toxic things you can do. First of all, now they have a sex pheromone lure that will call them into traps. So that is a non-toxic way. If you spray them with soapy water, they're a homopteran, and they depend on very waxy cuticle that dissolves the wax. Nobody's evaluated how well that works in terms of the long term, but it's cheap, easy, and non-toxic. And I've seen pictures of the thousands of them on a tree trunk. I would spray that with soapy water and see what happens. But the biggest defense against these non-native insects is to stop bringing them in. Once they're here, they're a huge problem, and there's no easy solution. I will say that I have 2 records of birds eating them in my yard this year. Watched it happen, so maybe they'll learn to like them. I don't know.
Okay, couple more questions that just came in. I can't grow an oak. Are there supportive shrubs?
Well, first I'd ask why you can't grow an oak, and you're going to say because my yard's too small. There are small oaks. There's things like dwarf chinquapin oak. It makes acorns when it's 5 feet tall. It's kind of like a shrub. So there are possibilities for small oaks. But if you don't want to grow an oak, yeah, native viburnums are good, things like Viburnum dentatum. Or you can say this is a perfect opportunity to focus on the flowering plants that give you a good pollinator garden. And in that respect, you want to have plants that are flowering from April all the way through the end of October. Now, if you have a really small yard, that's tough to do. But think of your entire neighborhood as a single pollinator garden, because any native bee can go the length of your neighborhood to get the pollen and nectar that they need. But they need it all the time. They need a continuous sequence of blooms in order to make it. They can't say, well, I'm gonna feed my young through June and then stop in July and I'll wait till things bloom again in August. It's got to be constant.
Okay, Joe, do you want to take the next one?
Sure. We have another chat question. It's how can native nurseries be motivated to move their operations towards a model of open pollinated local ecotype plants as opposed to selling plants of unknown origin? And
as cultivars. It is frustrating. You go to the nursery to buy a native plant, and typically you can find is a cultivar. This is changing. They understand the need. We've been talking about it for years. But remember, the marketplace drives what is sold. We are transitioning from the idea that plants are just decorations to the idea that plants do really important things, and we're going to buy them for their function as well as their looks. And if you buy them for their function, you have to consider straight species over cultivars in many, not all cases, but in many cases. And that's where the open pollination comes in. Locally sourced is certainly best, because then you know that they are adapted to this particular region. But that's a challenge. These people are in business. They've got to sell enough plants to be able to stay in business. And if it's just a tiny little operation, it's not going to work. So we need to increase the marketplace so that the demand is there. And be prepared to go to the nursery. If what you want is not there, be prepared to walk away instead of buying what is there, because then they'll simply keep supplying what they always have in the past, but say, no, I don't want a cultivar, I want a straight species, can you get that for me? When they hear that enough, then they will.
Okay, you have any other questions, Chuck or Joe?
Yeah, yes. We have another question.
Yes.
What are some of the new insights and surprises that you have learned about native plants since your earlier groundbreaking book, Bringing Nature Home?
That's a great question. That's an easy answer too. The big thing we've learned is how important certain plants are and how unimportant other plants are. It would be so easy if all native plants were equally powerful. And you could say, I don't care what it is, you plant it, as long as the provenance is right and it grows here, it'll be great. That's just not the case. We've got it's like building a house. Your house is gonna stand up because of the 2x4s and the 4x4s and the support beams. And they have to be part of the house. You can't build a house with the wallpaper and rugs only. So we've got to have those powerhouse plants, those keystone plants in our landscapes, and then we can diversify with other species of native plants. Diversity is good, and every time you add a native, it will add something to your yard. But you got to have those powerhouses to keep the that food web going. That's the most important thing I think we've learned. Very recently, learning how terribly destructive lights are. You know, I always knew that they weren't great, but I don't know, I just didn't think it was that big a problem, but it's turning out to be a huge problem. So that's another thing that's actually good news, because it's so easy to address. It's so easy to address.
Okay. While we're waiting for another question, I'd like to ask Dr. Talamy about the future with white-tailed deer. I mean, what can we possibly do about, I mean, fencing is just not an option for so much, and yet as we get more browsing material out there, I just can see more and more deer coming, and they seem to leave the non-natives alone, and they're go munching after our new native plantings.
They do. There are four reasons that too many deer are just a huge problem. One is they're wrecking the ecosystems that support us. They pick off recruitment. So any young oak tree that pops up in our forest, the deer nail it right away. But as you said, they don't eat the autumn olive, they don't eat the porcelain berry, they don't eat the burning bush, all of these things that now that's what our forests are starting to look like. And if that goes on for the age of a tree, the tree falls down and you get nothing but this Asian stuff to replace it. So in the long run, that's devastating. They encourage disease. I mean, we wouldn't have Lyme disease if we didn't have too many deer. Huge problem. It's bad for the deer. They're in many places in this area, they were up to 14 times over the carrying capacity. There is no population that can grow forever. So they can either crash by destroying their own environment, or we have two choices. We can add predators, but we've taken the predators away. So now the only predator deer has in most particularly urban centers is the car. That's, you know, insurance company know that's not a good solution. So we know how to control deer. We just don't have the emotional readiness to do it. And I understand that, but this is a societal problem. The fact that we have too many deer is the most important feature that encourages invasive plants in our forest. Because of this, they tip the competitive balance against our natives. There are really interesting studies that have come out in the last few years with deer exclosure experiments, where deer have been excluded, some for 10 years, some for 20 years. There was a 10-year study pitting trilliums against garlic mustard. You would think garlic mustard would win in a second, but no, the trilliums won in the long run when deer were excluded. But when deer are there, they eat every trillium immediately, and that's the end of that. So, so controlling deer just from an invasive species perspective is really important. So lots of good reasons to do it. We know exactly how to do it, but we're unwilling to do it. And a lot of people have said that. I can say it too, but I don't know that'll make a difference.
We have some more questions. Chuck or Joe?
Yes,
Yeah.
we do. I'll take the next one, Chuck.
Okay.
How would you recommend handling trees sprouting in a field where you are trying to make a meadow? Would you remove some or leave some?
Well, we're in the East, where meadows, or what we used to call the Eastern Prairie, is a transitional stage unless you have particular soil. So that's succession. It moves from that meadow through scrub into a forest. That's what it wants to do naturally. So if you want to keep a meadow, you have to control the woodies. And the easiest way to do that, most people just mow. That will cut them down, but it doesn't kill the root system. So they end up mowing more and more frequently, and that's not natural for the meadows either. So I recommend spot treatment. Either dig them out as they come in as seedlings, or you know, little spot. I like to cut and paint with an herbicide, so you're using very little material. But it's something you have to do constantly. The big problem with making meadows in this area is that most of those woodies that come in are non-native. You've got multiflora rose, you've got autumn olive are two big ones that'll come in right away, and porcelain berry is everywhere. You just can't let that get going, or you're not going to have a meadow. So meadows are hard in this part of the country because of the amount of labor involved. But they're beautiful, they're worth it, and they do house an awful lot of species.
Okay, I'll take the next one. This just came into the chat. Is any species of oak superior in terms of ecological value and disease resistance?
That's a great question. We're actually doing that experiment this summer. You'll notice if you go on the Native Plant Finder that the plants are listed at the genus level. And that's because when you go to the literature and you look at what eats what plant, it's typically listed at the genus level. It says, well, this species of moth eats oaks, but it doesn't tell you which oaks. So we're comparing 16 species of oaks found in the East here this summer, and in a couple months we'll be able to tell the answer. My general sense is that most oaks are good hosts. So if an insect is adapted to eating one oak, and it can probably eat most of them, there's probably a slight difference between the red oak group and the white oak group, with the white oak group being a little bit better than the red oak group. In terms of disease resistance, with the diseases we have right here in the Philadelphia area, we've got oak leaf scorch, which is a serious problem for the red oak group. And in that sense, the white oak group is totally resistant to that, and a better choice. But if you go a little farther west, then you have oak wilt, which hits the white oak group. So it depends on where you are. But one thing I think we're going to show this summer is that now the most commonly planted oak is swamp white oak. It's very prominent in the trade, and people are planting it all over the place. But it has thick, fuzzy leaves, and it is the least attractive to insects. So we're planting. It's a good plant to plant, but it's probably the one that is going to support insects the least. That's my prediction.
Okay, I have one more.
Go ahead, Joe.
In your book, bats were not discussed. Do you have any recommendations regarding encouraging bats?
Well, of course, here in the Northeast, we got clobbered by white nose disease. We didn't, the bats did. It was, hasn't been proven, but everybody's pretty sure that spelunkers brought it over from Europe. European bats are resistant to it, and it devastated many of our bat species, particularly little brown bat, the ones that spend the winter in caves. So the number of bats in our skies in this part of the country has plummeted, by, I don't know what, 90% or something. So, there are bat houses that can encourage them during places for them to roost during the summertime. I have 2 bat houses up. I've never had a bat. You know, I didn't spend a lot of time talking about it because their populations are knocked down so much. There's a little bit of good news though, and that is there's some evidence that the bats that remain do have some resistance. So they're probably going to increase in abundance over time. But the things that eat night-flying insects in general are in trouble. Things like our whippoorwills and Chuck-Will's widow, the poor wills, these birds that eat large moths at night, they're way down because of this insect decline. We have lost so many insects that the things that depend on them, including bats, are suffering. So the best way to help bats is to build up those insect populations.
Thank you. Okay, we have another question. Is it viable to allow native species to return to an area, understanding that we should remove invasive species if they occur, i.e. allow nature to run its course instead of designing and planting?
I think you're talking about addition by subtraction. So in other words, you don't have to plant anything. You just have to keep the ones you don't want out, and then the natives will come in. If that's what you mean, yes, that's a very viable. That is the easiest and cheapest approach to bringing back a native, local native genotypes. They will come in on their own. And I mentioned earlier the blue jays moving acorns around. They will fly with an acorn up to 2 miles away. So you don't even have to have seed-bearing trees nearby, and you still can have nature move these things into your area. So that is totally viable. Just keep the invasives out and let the natives come in. Absolutely.
Okay, I found one more. The yews beside my house have lots of bird nests. Is there a native plant that I can replace them with that will also provide nesting spaces?
Eastern red cedar.
Oh, that was easy.
You know, we call it the conifer conundrum. There are very few native conifers right here. A lot of people have white pines, and they're big open trees. They're not great for nesting, but they don't really belong right here in the Philly area. They're more of a Piedmont and mountainous plant. There's no problem having them here, but the one that does belong here, that's very dense and it's perfect for nesting birds, is eastern red cedar.
Okay, well, we're waiting for another question. I'd like to ask Dr. Tallamy about power line right-of-ways. Now, we've been to court and we've lost about how they herbicide treat right-of-ways that have gone through areas where we live. Has there been any headway or talk about maybe the utilities buying into the homegrown national park concept?
Yes, there has, nationwide. And I went to a conference in, I think it was Cincinnati, on exactly that subject, where there were companies from all over the country who are actually doing this. So was this Pico that
MedAd.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a growing thing. So I don't know. Hang in there. I think they'll get the message sooner or later. But.
Okay. All right. Do we have any other questions, Joe, Chuck?
I have one that's naive. Now you're talking to a chemical engineer, Doug, so
okay.
Just take this with a grain of salt. Why is it so important to stabilize and grow the bird populations? If you go way up the funnel and look in the big scheme of things, why are birds so important? I understand insects are important to get the birds, but why are the birds important?
Well, all species are important. Why do I use, and all species are important because the number of species in an ecosystem determines how productive and how stable it is. So every time you lose a species, no matter what it is, it makes that ecosystem less productive. It's making fewer ecosystem services, and it's less stable. So it's less likely to be able to withstand a hit from a hurricane or a bulldozer or something else. Why do I talk about birds a lot? A couple reasons. They're the charismatic megafauna these days. We've got about 70 million people in this country that would check a box saying they are bird watchers or they feed birds during the winter time. So it's my hook. If I said, I want to help rodents because they all eat insects, you know, it just doesn't have the same catch as birds do. So birds are important. They're predators. You don't have healthy bird communities unless you have healthy prey items beneath them. So if you can create a healthy bird community, you're doing a lot of things right. So they are indicator species, but I don't want to imply that they're more important than other species. All the species are important.
So with climate change and 2 degrees to 3 degree temperature increases wiping out 20 to 25% of the species, what does that say?
That's bad news. There are a lot of reasons climate change is terrible, but this prediction by the UN that we're going to lose 1 million species, that's largely climate change driven, but it's also habitat loss driven. That is not an option. This is this attitude that we can lose it, it'll be okay. It won't be okay. We cannot lose it. We have to turn this around. That's why, we're going to have an election in November, and you're going to pretty soon see the top 10 things that voters are worried about, and biodiversity loss won't be on that list. It ought to be number 1. It's what's keeping us on this planet, but people don't know that. So climate change, huge problems. It's, climate change is like too many deer. We know what the solution is. We just don't feel like doing it. It's a little frustrating.
That's a good analogy. I like that. I have to use that. I'll give you credit for it, but I got to.
Okay, I forget what I just said, so use it.
Well, the deer. The analogy that we know how to get rid of the deer.
Right.
Won't do it. Yeah. And we can certainly stop burning carbon.
Yep.
Okay.
Any other questions come in, Joe?
Yeah, there's someone raising their hand, and in the meantime, there's another question that I'll ask, and it's, is there a fruiting shrub or tree that is best for birds?
Okay, well, one thing we didn't talk about was the berries that a lot of these plants make. That birds, that after they reproduce, a lot of birds want to replace, they want to move their diet from high protein and high fat, that's the insect-based diet, and they want to move it more to carbohydrates. So that's where the berries come in. And berries, particularly in the fall, that are high in fat themselves, are really important for birds because if they're migrating, they need a lot of fat for the migration, or if they're spending the winter, they need a lot of fat to build up their reserves to get through the winter. So things like native viburnums are about 50% fat, the berries. Those are very valuable plants. Here's another one, poison ivy. Poison ivy berries are wonderful things for birds. Dogwood berries are also very high in fat. The wax myrtle, you have more of that along the shore, but it grows inland as well. That's very high in fat. Those are really valuable berries. Summer berries, things like shadbush or amelanchier, that produces berries first, so that gives a lot of birds an early shot at carbohydrates. Blueberries are wonderful for birds. So we like to eat them too, but if you can grow a few bushes and not touch them, the birds will really appreciate it.
Okay, we're going to try this. Kathy Heel, you want to ask a question? Go ahead.
Yes, I have numerous bee pollinator plants, and now bees are starting to invade my brick mortar and my window siding. How should I control these?
They're taking advantage of the holes in your brick mortar.
Mm-hmm.
They're probably not hollowing out the brick mortar itself. So you need to repair that damage, and then they won't be able to use it. Carpenter bees, if you're talking about carpenter bees, they do chew holes in wood. And, if they do that long enough, it can be an issue. There's really, the best way to control carpenter bees is to use wood that they don't like. But if your house is already built, you're not going to do that. But they don't like pressure treated lumber. It's essentially toxic to them. What they do like is pine and redwood, softwoods that they can chew into easily. So I don't know, replacing the wood with something they don't like, or there's the old-fashioned can of Raid that certainly kills them.
Okay, we have two. Phil, do you have some questions that you can ask? I don't see the ones that you're texting me about.
I do see one. I'll ask that, Phil, in the meantime. We're trying to let a pasture return to forest. We'd like to let natural progression run its course with selective weeding, but so much pressure from invasives like autumn olive, multiflora, rose, Japanese stiltgrass. Any advice for this process? And by the way, love your books.
Oh, well, thank you. Japanese stiltgrass, we're not even going to talk about that because I do not have a solution for that. That is a huge problem. But if you do let it go back to woods, that will become less of a problem as it becomes more shaded. So what you want to control are those woodies. And you have to kill the roots. There's two ways to do that. And that is cut the plant so frequently that it finally exhausts the energy in the root system. That's a lot of work and it can take years. But if you don't want to use any herbicide and you stick with it, that will work. You keep cutting it back, and I mean frequently, like once a week. Or you can cut it off at the base. Works, great for multiflora rose and autumn olive, and then you paint an herbicide on the stump. Even that typically requires, maybe 2 applications. Everybody's worried about so much pesticide, but that uses very little, and it's often not strong enough to kill the roots. But if you don't kill the roots, it simply keeps coming back. But that is the least, that will take the least of your energy. And don't be discouraged. You can get rid of those guys. Just ask my wife. I'll show you that picture again. Our 10 acres were thoroughly, thoroughly invaded, and they are not anymore. So it does work, but and it'll get you out in nature too.
Okay, we're pretty close to 8:30, a little past. Do you have maybe one more question? Any other?
I know Phil has one, and I have one here. So.
Okay.
Phil, I want to ask yours first.
There was a question of what are good native coniferous trees for central Pennsylvania?
Central PA, white pine for sure. Eastern red cedar, I already mentioned that. As you move into the more northern regions, you can even white fir starts to work. But white pine would be the big one. That'd be the one that would normally occur there.
And then I have this question, is there a fruiting shrub or tree that is best for birds?
I think we dealt with that one.
Is it oak? Is it?
Well, okay, that is fruit. That's a nut. Yeah, oaks make acorns. There are a lot of birds that depend on acorns. So you're talking about any...
It says a fruiting tree, a fruiting
Yeah, fruiting. Well, that I talked about the berries, remember?
Okay.
All right.
Bill, did you have another one?
Go ahead. No, we're done.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Okay. Well, Dr. Talamy, we want to thank you so much for your time and all the effort you put into trying to turn these things back into something that we can all live with and be sustainable. And it's well done, and large appreciation of. We appreciate it. And I want to apologize that we hadn't got 700 people in.
But I see you snuck a few more in there. I see a bigger number, so that's good.
I do not know what happened, Dr. Talamy, and I feel I'm very embarrassed about this.
Oh, geez, there's nothing you can do about it. I think they should give you your money back, though.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
thanks again, everybody, for attending, and thank you so much for your work.